Welcome, and this video is going to be about beauty in physics, and it's modeled in part on an article that was written by George Stanciu entitled Physics, Beauty, and the Divine Mind. First thing that we want to do is we want to distinguish between beauty and taste. And there is a video, Young People's Concerts. It's a whole series, a television series, and Leonard Bernstein runs it. And he said an interesting thing. He made this distinction between beauty and taste. And as he's playing the first movement of Mozart's 40th Symphony, and he's finished, and he turns around and he says to the audience, whether you liked that or not, that was beautiful. The distinction that he makes is that taste is what we like. It's conditioned by what we know, what we're used to. Beauty, on the other hand, actually has some standards. And this does away with that idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's not. We're going to see a lot of examples here where we have educated people who are saying that in their respective fields of study, there are standards of beauty. And in general, they can be reduced down to simplicity, harmony, and brilliance. And there are some different names for these as well, which we'll talk about. But sometimes it takes time to be able to see beauty, to know what to look for. There are some examples of this. People who learn about like good wine, right? I know very, very little about wines. When someone who knows about wine drinks it, they have a whole other experience than I have. Classical music, I'm learning about, just starting to learn about now, and it's completely changing my experience, and it's changing my taste for music as well. And I'm seeing beauty where I had not before. Physics is, I have a degree in physics, I teach physics, and I have found beauty there that my students have a hard time seeing, and that I didn't see when I first started learning it. Mathematics, same thing, great books, poetry. The simple fact is that there are some things that get better the more we learn about them, and some things get worse. The more we learn about some things, well, the less we want to know about them. In a course on great music by Robert Greenberg, he tells this story. He says, a great truth has just been revealed. Without a large-scale structural context, detail cannot be contextualized. Without an understanding of how something works on a large scale, we might not perceive the details that make something interesting. We can only appreciate the detail if we first understand the large-scale context, the rules of the game, the form of the piece. And he gives the example of somebody turning a great double play in baseball. And then someone says, wow, that was beautiful. Someone who doesn't know baseball doesn't get it. So let's do away with this distinction now, or rather, emphasize this distinction between taste and beauty, and that even though we can't perceive beauty sometimes, that doesn't mean that it's not there. Also, Charles Balin is a professor at Yale University, and in an undergraduate course for non-science majors, he tells a story, that I'll tell a story later, about how he experienced beauty while sitting in a graduate physics class. And then he says to the class this, he says, so don't be condescending to the physics majors who are up late on a Thursday night working on problem sets, because they have access to realms of aesthetic experience that you can only dream of. Okay, so what is beauty? The first aspect is simplicity. And Heisenberg, the physicist, talks about it. He says, frightening simplicity and wholeness. In other words, there's a sense of unity there. Disconnected ideas do not form beauty. So I've heard this called simplicity, I've heard it called unity, this idea of oneness. Okay. And harmony is, Heisenberg calls this particular aspect of beauty, the proper conformity of the parts to one another and to the whole. So the things fit together. And John Wheeler says, every law of physics goes back to some symmetry of nature, this idea of symmetry, this fitting of things together with each other. Without harmony, a theory lacks unity. Another word that I've heard used to describe this aspect of beauty is balance. So we've got simplicity, harmony, and then brilliance. This is one that I find hardest to describe. I've also heard it called clarity. I've heard it referred to as fitting surprises. Some other ideas here, it allows for insight. It allows for intelligibility. You can sort of see it and understand it. Not necessarily you can wrap your mind around it, that there's no mystery in the thing, but that it allows for intelligibility. The experience that we have when we meet with brilliance, I think, is one of recognition. Peter Kraft talks about how when we watch or when we read The Lord of the Rings or watch the movie, there's a sense of recognition, like, of course, yes, that's what elves are really like. And I think that's what brilliance is. And mathematicians and physicists talk about this, where, for example, something like general relativity, it's a fitting surprise. It's surprising, and yet at the same time it makes sense, as if to say, of course that's the way it would be. And then I've heard this referred to, I think, also as innate inevitability, that's the way it has to be. I've had this experience with landscape, where I look at a landscape, a mountain range or something like that, and there's this deep sense that that's the way it has to be. It can't be any other way. I've heard an artist refer to this innate inevitability that he finds, and which is his inspiration. And he finds it in the human body and physiology, and also in landscape. And physicists have talked about this with respect to general relativity as well, that it seems, well, that's, of course, it makes perfect sense, that's the way it has to be. And in Beethoven's music as well, here's an example of this. Leonard Bernstein writes, many composers have been able to write heavenly tunes and respectable fugues. Some composers can orchestrate the C major scale so it sounds like a masterpiece, or full with notes so that a harmonic novelty is achieved. Right? So he's commenting on the skills of composers. But this is all mere dust, nothing compared to the magic ingredient sought by them all, the inexplicable ability to know what the next note has to be. By the way, those are his italics, not mine. Beethoven had this gift in a degree that leaves them all panting in the rearguard. When he really did it, as in the funeral march of the Eroica, he produced an entity that always seems to me to have been previously written in heaven and then merely dictated to him. Not that the dictation was easily achieved. We know with what agonies he paid for the special space carved out in the cosmos into which this movement just fits, predetermined and perfect. And we find beauty in experiments as well. George Johnson, here's a quote from his book, The 10 Most Beautiful Experiments. And notice here that he talks about the elegance, the beauty. He talks about the simplicity, the logical simplicity of the apparatus, of the analysis. And then again, also, he talks about the inevitability, as pure and inevitable as the lines of a Greek statue. Okay. And so here's some experiences of beauty. I'm going to run through some of these. If you want to stop and read them, you can pause the video. But George Stanciu is a physicist, and so here you go. And here's another story from George Stanciu about an experience with beauty. Here's an experience of beauty in mathematics that I found in an interesting place. It was actually a book about the Greeks by H.D.F. Kiddo. And I'll let you read this. You can pause the video to read if you want. And the story that Charles Balin tells, he says he's sitting in a class, and the professor is putting things on the board really fast, and he was doing the things that graduate students do. He was trying to copy it all down so that he was going to go back later and figure out what the hell the professor was talking about. But at some point, he realizes that the professor is putting up the derivation of Chandrasekhar's limit, which is something having to do with black holes, the limit, the mass limit for a white dwarf. And when he realized it, he stopped and he just wrote Chandra in his notebook, and he just watched, and he said it was great. The only thing he can compare it to is like a piece of music that unfolds in time. For me personally, I had an experience of this as well. I was taking high school physics, I'm in calculus, I'm taking physics at the same time, and I sat down and I looked at some of the equations, and I realized that when I used calculus, really what I had was one equation and a couple of calculus operations done on that one equation. And it was pretty early on in the course, but I was hooked. I thought it was amazing. And I didn't realize it at the time, but what I was having was an experience of beauty. That I saw the unity, I saw the brilliance, the harmony of the physics that I happened to be studying. And in geometry as well, I used to enjoy proofs. I know a lot of people don't, but this idea that we can start with something and then pull in other things that we know or the assumptions that we have in our system and then prove something. I thought it was fascinating. And again, these were experiences of beauty, but I didn't realize it at the time. Not until later, as I've learned and heard other people's experiences of beauty, have I realized that that's, in fact, what that was. So now let's talk about why beauty. What is it about beauty? Why is it important? Well, beauty points to what is true and good. It's the splendor of truth is one of the things I've heard, one of the ways of describing beauty. It's the splendor of truth. And Paul Dirac even says it's more important for the scientist to have beautiful equations than agreement with experience. Because there have been times that beautiful equations seem to have been proven wrong by experiment, but then it was later found out that there was something wrong with the experiment. Okay, whoops. Also, beauty is a means to what is good and true. Also, it seems to make us better. We need beauty. It seems to be part of our nature. So in order to be fulfilled and reach our true potential, we need beauty in our lives in this way. Peter Kraft says this: every human soul craves the good, the true, and the beautiful, absolutely and without limit. Again, an interesting story from this course by Robert Greenberg. He says, one last great Handel anecdote before we put a wrap on this lecture. This anecdote is told by George Hogarth in his book Music, History, Biography, and Criticism, published in 1838, and we quote, when Messiah was first performed in London, the audience was exceedingly struck and affected by the music. Some days after the first exhibition of this oratorio, Mr. Handel went to pay his respects to Lord Canute, with whom he was acquainted. His lordship, as was natural, paid him some compliments on the noble entertainment which he had lately given to the town. My lord, said Handel, I should be sorry if I only entertained them. I wish to make them better. Well, speaking strictly for myself, I am better for knowing Messiah. I trust we are all better for knowing Messiah. There's a sense here that beauty helps us be fulfilled, that it's part of our nature that we need beauty. Now, what beauty is an interesting thing. In a materialistic world, beauty does not make any sense. In other words, if we assume that the only things that exist are material things and that there is no spiritual world, then we have a hard time making sense of beauty. These accounts from physicists, mathematicians, artists, there is an objective standard for beauty, but the problem is that beauty is not a material thing, nor is the source of beauty. It's not in the things, it's not in ourselves. There's this other standard. But it makes perfect sense if we include God. Beauty comes from God and is really just a reflection of Him, who's more than just another beautiful thing. He Himself is the source of beauty, right? He is beauty itself. What I'm going to do for the rest of this video now is just put up some quotes quickly. You can pause them and read them if you want. They're quotes from various people about beauty, particularly in physics and math. So enjoy.